Imagine a world where the threat of war looms like a storm cloud over every castle and village, where rival lords plot against each other in shadowed corridors, their armies poised for battle. Yet instead of clashing swords, these enemies meet under open skies, surrounded by music, laughter, and the smell of roasting meat. This was the unexpected reality of medieval Europe, where festivals weren't just celebrations, they were carefully crafted tools of peace, designed to turn bitter rivals into uneasy allies. It's a story of how pageantry and feasting could do what armies and treaties often failed to achieve, keeping the peace in a fractured world. Think about the tension in those grand halls, where lords who'd spent years scheming against one another now sat side by side, forced to share bread and wine. The stakes couldn't have been higher. One wrong move, one insult spoken too loudly, and the fragile truce could shatter. But that's exactly why these festivals mattered. They were a stage where power could be displayed without bloodshed, where rivalries could be settled through jousts and poetry contests instead of battles. The tournaments, the feasts, the dances, all of it was a delicate dance of diplomacy wrapped in the guise of merriment. And here's the most fascinating part: it worked. For all the violence of the medieval world, these gatherings became a rare space where enemies could lower their guards, if only for a few days. They shared stories, competed in games, and sometimes even forged bonds that lasted beyond the festival grounds. It wasn't perfect. Conflict still flared, and not every gathering ended peacefully. But for a society constantly on the brink of chaos, these events were a lifeline. So how did they pull it off? What made these festivals so effective at taming the tempers of warlords and knights? That's the story we're about to uncover, a tale of spectacle, strategy, and the surprising power of celebration. The roots of medieval festivals stretch back to a time when Europe was still stitching itself together from the fragments of the Roman Empire. In those early centuries, pagan harvest celebrations and ancient solstice rituals blended with the new Christian calendar, creating a rhythm of feast days that marked the turning of the year. Villagers would gather to honor saints or welcome spring, sharing food and drink in a rare break from backbreaking labor. But as kingdoms grew stronger, these simple gatherings caught the attention of rulers who saw something more: an opportunity. By the time castles dotted the landscape and lords vied for power, festivals had transformed into something far grander. Kings and nobles began sponsoring elaborate events, not just for devotion or merriment, but as calculated displays of influence. A lavish feast could demonstrate wealth, a tournament could showcase military skill, and a week of revelry could remind restless vassals where their loyalty belonged. Take, for example, the famous Pentecost feast of King Henry II of England, where he gathered barons who'd been at each other's throats for years. Under the pretense of honoring a holy day, he forced them to sit together, toasting with golden cups while musicians played, a subtle reminder that defiance would cost them more than just land. What made these festivals so effective wasn't just the spectacle, but the unspoken rules that governed them. A lord might nurse grudges in private, but in the public eye, he was expected to follow the script, to cheer at the joust, admire the poetry, and exchange gifts with rivals. Even the seating arrangements were carefully orchestrated, placing enemies just close enough to converse, but not so near that daggers might suddenly appear. And for all their pomp, these events had a surprising flexibility. A dispute over territory could be settled not by bloodshed, but by a chess match or archery contest, with the winner gaining prestige and the loser saving face. The genius of this system lay in its duality. Festivals functioned as both pressure valve and stage. They allowed simmering conflicts to be channeled into controlled competitions, while giving lords a chance to posture without actual war. When the Duke of Burgundy hosted a tournament inviting knights from feuding regions, the message was clear: grievances could be settled in the arena, not on the battlefield. Of course, tensions still flared, wine loosened tongues, and old hatreds didn't vanish overnight. But for a society with no standing armies or police forces, these gatherings were among the few tools rulers had to enforce order without force. Behind the masks and minstrels, medieval festivals were a masterclass in soft power. They turned the chaotic rivalries of the nobility into something manageable, even predictable. And though the world has changed, the echoes of that strategy linger in modern diplomacy, state dinners, in international sporting events, even in corporate retreats designed to smooth over workplace rivalries. The methods may have evolved, but the goal remains the same: to keep the peace, one carefully orchestrated celebration at a time. At the heart of these medieval gatherings lay a brilliant psychological insight, one that modern science would only confirm centuries later. When sworn enemies broke bread together in the flickering torchlight of a great hall, something subtle but profound happened. The very act of sharing food triggered deep-rooted human instincts. Studies now show that communal eating releases oxytocin, the so-called bonding hormone, creating a biological foundation for trust. Medieval lords may not have known the chemistry, but they understood the effect. A rival who'd laughed at your jester's jokes yesterday was harder to vilify on the battlefield today. This was the alchemy of festive diplomacy. By stripping away formal roles and replacing them with temporary equality, where even bitter rivals wore the same festival colors or competed under the same tournament rules, these events reshaped perceptions. A lord who'd been reduced to a villain in wartime stories suddenly became human again. A man who appreciated fine wine, who cheered when his falcon struck prey, who might even clap politely when his enemy's son won a poetry contest. The historian Orderic Vitalis captured this perfectly when describing a 12th century truce feast, noting how former foes set aside their hatred with their helmets, finding common ground in marveling at acrobats or debating the merits of different hunting dogs. The genius of these festivals was how they bypassed rational resistance with emotional appeals. Threats and treaties spoke to the mind, but music, dance, and spectacle spoke directly to the heart. A well-timed jest could disarm tension faster than any diplomatic letter. The shared adrenaline of a tournament, the collective gasp as lances shattered, the roar when a favorite knight prevailed created bonds no dry negotiation could match. Modern conflict resolution experts call this positive interdependence, where shared goals or experiences override old divisions. Medieval Europe weaponized this principle through carefully orchestrated merriment. Consider the case of the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, where Kings Francis I of France and Henry VIII of England transformed their rivalry into a spectacle of mutual admiration. For over 2 weeks, they jousted, feasted, and even wrestled, with Henry reportedly losing badly, all while their courts mingled freely. The temporary city erected for the event, complete with fountains flowing with wine, became a neutral space where national animosities dissolved into personal connections. Though political tensions resurfaced later, contemporaries noted how the sheer scale of shared wonder created moments of genuine rapport between the two monarchs. This psychological playbook extended beyond kings to local lords as well. In the German states, where petty nobles constantly skirmished over borders, seasonal markets doubled as truce zones. Competing families would send their sons to compete in archery contests rather than raids, their daughters to exchange embroidered favors rather than insults. The festive atmosphere provided what psychologists now call face-saving exits or ways for proud warriors to back down without humiliation. Losing a wrestling match to an enemy carried less stigma than retreating from a siege, and often achieved the same territorial compromises. Yet festivals weren't just about softening hearts, they were masterclasses in social engineering. The strict protocols governing these events created what anthropologists term ritual frames, artificial environments with their own rules. Within these frames, a lord who refused to toast a rival wasn't just being hostile, he was violating sacred hospitality codes, risking social condemnation far beyond the immediate conflict. This external pressure often forced antagonists into civil interactions that, over time, became genuine. The festivals essentially hacked human psychology, using pleasure and peer pressure to achieve what force could not. The echoes of this medieval wisdom still resonate today, from Olympic Games that temporarily suspend global tensions to corporate team-building retreats that dissolve office rivalries through shared challenges. We still use joy as a diplomatic tool. The knights and lords of the Middle Ages discovered a fundamental truth. It's harder to hate someone when you've seen them cheer the same victory, wince at the same jokes, or raise a glass under the same starry sky. Their festivals weren't mere parties, they were laboratories of human connection, proving time and again that sometimes the quickest path to peace isn't through the battlefield, but through the banquet hall. Royal weddings in the Middle Ages weren't just romantic affairs, they were elaborate peace treaties dressed in silk and jewels. When Henry V of England married Catherine of Valois in 1420, the ceremony didn't just join two people, it temporarily bridged two warring nations. For weeks, the bitter conflict of the 100 Years' War gave way to feasts, tournaments, and performances, as if the entire continent had agreed to hit pause on bloodshed. This was diplomacy disguised as celebration, where the exchange of vows carried the weight of international policy. What made these weddings so effective was their sheer public spectacle. Unlike secret treaties whispered in palace chambers, royal marriages unfolded before thousands, nobles, clergy, and commoners alike. Every gesture, from the holding of hands to the sharing of a ceremonial cup, became a binding act witnessed by the masses. When the Duke of Burgundy attended the wedding of his rival's daughter, his presence wasn't just polite, it was a silent surrender to the new alliance. Crowds gathered not just to admire the bride's gown, but to see sworn enemies stand shoulder to shoulder, smiling through gritted teeth if necessary. The message was clear: betrayal now would mean humiliation before all of Europe. The rituals themselves were carefully designed to reinforce unity. The act of draping a cloak over the bride's shoulders, for example, wasn't just chivalrous, it symbolized the groom's family enveloping the bride's kin in protection. Joint prayers at the altar transformed personal faith into public covenant, while the exchange of rings mirrored the exchange of political promises. Even the feast menus held meaning, serving dishes from both regions, like English roast beef alongside French wine, offered an edible metaphor for harmony. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect was how these weddings created irreversible social bonds. A lord might break a written treaty, but how could he attack his own son-in-law's lands? When Ferdinand and Isabella united Spain through marriage, they didn't just merge kingdoms, they crafted a web of familial loyalty that made rebellion unthinkable. Their daughter's wedding to the heir of the Holy Roman Empire later extended this web across Europe, turning potential battlefields into family reunions. Of course, not all marital peacekeeping succeeded. The infamous wedding of Margaret of Anjou to Henry VI of England was meant to end Anglo-French hostilities, but instead became a flashpoint for rebellion when the bride's penniless father failed to deliver promised territories. Yet even failed weddings bought time years of fragile truce where diplomacy could work where war had not. the legacy of these matrimonial masterstrokes endures in modern statecraft. Today's diplomatic summits and state visits still borrow from the medieval playbook, using shared meals and photo ops to foster goodwill. But nothing quite matches the audacity of those royal weddings where love stories, or the illusion of them, held empires together. Behind every vow, behind every toast, lay an unspoken truth. Sometimes the strongest chains aren't forged in armorers' workshops, but in the delicate clasp of hands before an altar. The thunder of hooves, the splintering of lances, the roar of the crowd tournaments transformed the deadly business of war into something closer to theater. At first glance, these events seemed like simple displays of martial skill, but beneath the pageantry lay a sophisticated system for channeling violence into ritual. The jousting lists became neutral ground where rival knights could clash without sparking actual battles, where a shattered lance might resolve a border dispute that would otherwise cost hundreds of lives. Take the tournament of St. Inglevert in 1390, where French and English knights, bitter enemies in the 100 Years' War, met not on some blood-soaked battlefield, but in a carefully regulated contest of honor. The rules were strict, lances tipped with coronals to prevent lethal wounds, judges overseeing every pass, and a shared code of chivalry binding all participants. For 30 days, these warriors competed in jousts, melees, and swordplay, not for territory, but for something far more precious in their world reputation. And here's the twist: by the end, many left with grudging respect for their opponents. The chronicler Jean Froissart noted how English knights, long vilified in French courts, suddenly became worthy adversaries rather than faceless enemies. The brilliance of these tournaments lay in their dual nature. For the knights, they offered a chance to prove valor without the chaos of real combat. A well-aimed strike could humble a rival lord's champion, settling a feud without razing villages. Meanwhile, in the stands, nobles conducted diplomacy under the guise of spectatorship. Wagers changed hands, marriages were brokered, and alliances formed, all while the crowd's attention remained fixed on the arena. At the famous Smithfield tournament in 1357, Edward III of England used the spectacle to discreetly negotiate with captured French nobles, turning prisoners into guests and enemies into bargaining partners. Even the prizes reflected this delicate balance. Winners often received not gold or land, but symbolic treasures: a jeweled helmet, a falcon, a kiss from a noble lady. These tokens carried social weight far beyond their material value, allowing losers to concede gracefully. When the German knight Ulrich von Liechtenstein lost a joust in 1227, his opponent returned his horse and armor, a gesture that transformed humiliation into mutual respect. Such acts reinforced the tournament's true purpose, not to destroy rivals but to integrate them into a shared aristocratic culture. Of course, these events weren't foolproof. The infamous tournament of Chauvency in 1285 devolved into actual bloodshed when old grudges overrode the rules. Yet for every failure, there were dozens of successes, occasions where the thrill of competition dissolved animosity. The armor-clad warriors who rode against each other at dawn might well be sharing wine by dusk, trading stories of near misses and lucky strikes. In a world where honor was currency, these controlled clashes offered something revolutionary, a way to lose face without losing lives. Modern sports owe more to these medieval precedents than we might realize. The Olympic Games, international chess matches, even as sports tournaments, all follow the same basic principle of substituting symbolic conflict for real violence. But none capture the high-stakes drama of those dusty lists, where the difference between war and peace balanced on the point of a blunted lance. For all their pageantry, these tournaments were deadly serious business, proving that sometimes the best way to prevent a fight is to stage one. While castles and courts hosted their grand political spectacles, the true heartbeat of peacekeeping pulsed in the countryside. Every summer, when golden wheat swayed under the August sun, villages across Europe set aside their grievances for Lammas Day, a harvest festival so ancient its roots stretched back to pagan times. On this day, the rigid lines between rival lordships blurred as peasants from feuding territories gathered to bake the first loaves from new grain. What began as a simple Thanksgiving ritual became one of medieval society's most ingenious peace mechanisms, proving that full bellies could do what armed guards could not. Picture the scene: families from opposing villages arriving at a long-disputed field, not with weapons but with baskets, the air thick with the scent of fresh bread and brewing ale, children chasing each other through the stubble, elders swapping stories under makeshift tents. For one day, the man who'd been your enemy in a boundary dispute became your partner in the rhythmic work of binding sheaves. This was peace-building at its most elemental, not decreed from above, but forged through shared sweat and laughter. The genius of these festivals lay in their subtle psychology. By centering the celebration on communal labor, whether harvesting, threshing, or baking, they created what modern sociologists call superordinate goals. When villagers from rival territories had to cooperate to achieve something tangible, like filling a shared granary, old animosities faded against the immediate need to work together. The Chronicles of St. Albans Abbey record how a generations-old feud between two Hertfordshire villages dissolved after their joint Lammas harvest yielded an unprecedented bounty. Suddenly, the disputed strip of land between them mattered less than maintaining the cooperation that had fed both communities. Even the festival foods carried diplomatic weight. The ceremonial Lammas loaf, baked from flour milled jointly from both villages' grain, became a physical symbol of interdependence. Breaking bread together wasn't just metaphorical. It was a visceral reminder that next year's harvest depended on maintaining good fences and better relations. The ale flowed freely from communal barrels, deliberately placed so former adversaries would find themselves waiting elbow to elbow for refills, exchanging awkward pleasantries that sometimes blossomed into genuine camaraderie. Lords might dismiss these rustic gatherings as peasant superstition, but the smartest among them recognized their value. Many actively encouraged cross-border harvest festivals, knowing that villages at peace meant steady rents and fewer costly border skirmishes. Some even waived tolls for festival days, allowing produce and people to flow freely across normally contested boundaries. The pipe rolls of 13th century England show lords deliberately scheduling court hearings after Lammas, when tempers had cooled and compromises came easier over full stomachs. These festivals also served as vital pressure valves for simmering class tensions. When landowners joined the feasting, even symbolically handing out loaves or tasting the communal ale, it momentarily softened the harsh realities of feudal life. The same peasant who might curse his lord's taxes in June could share a toast with him in August, reminded that both depended on the land's bounty. Records from Suffolk describe how one particularly brutal harvest season turned to celebration when the local lord unexpectedly drove his own wagon load of grain to the communal bakehouse, transforming resentment into reluctant gratitude. The legacy of these rural peace rituals lingers in unexpected places. Modern agricultural fairs, neighborhood potlucks, even corporate team-building retreats all echo that ancient wisdom. Nothing builds bridges like shared labor and shared meals. The medieval world understood something we often forget: that diplomacy doesn't always happen in boardrooms or summits. Sometimes the most lasting peace begins with a loaf of warm bread, passed hand to hand across a makeshift table in a sunlit field. When church bells rang across medieval Europe announcing Christmas or Easter, they carried more than just holy significance. They became the law of the land. The Church's Truce of God wasn't a gentle suggestion. It was a sweeping edict that forced even the most warlike lords to sheathe their swords. From sunset on Christmas Eve until dawn after Epiphany, battlefields fell silent, siege engines stood idle, and soldiers who'd been trying to kill each other weeks earlier now knelt side by side in prayer. This wasn't just piety at work, it was one of history's most ambitious attempts to weaponize faith as a tool for peace. The mechanics behind these sacred truces reveal how deeply the Church understood human nature. By tying ceasefires to spiritually charged dates, they made violation unthinkable. A lord who attacked during Easter wasn't just breaking a rule, he was risking eternal damnation, alienating his own devout troops, and inviting retaliation from every neighboring ruler. The chronicles of Abbot Suger of Saint Denis describe how King Louis VI of France once excommunicated an entire knightly order for besieging a castle during Lent, turning what could have been a minor border skirmish into a cautionary tale heard in courts across Christendom. Pilgrimage festivals took this peacekeeping principle even further. When thousands flocked to Canterbury for Thomas Becket's feast day or to Santiago de Compostela during Jubilee years, the roads became neutral territory. Armored rivals who'd normally ambush each other on sight now traveled the same paths, protected by the pilgrims' white robes and wooden staffs, symbols that transformed them from combatants into penitents. The Canterbury Tales' diverse company of travelers wasn't just literary fiction. It reflected the real-world truce zones created by shared devotion. A Norman knight and Saxon merchant who might have dueled to the death elsewhere could find themselves splitting the cost of a Winchester in Rome, bonding over blistered feet and bad road food. What made these religious truces so effective was their built-in expiration date. Like modern ceasefires, they provided cooling-off periods where tempers could settle without either side losing face. A border dispute paused for Advent might resume in January, but often with softened positions, thanks to weeks of indirect negotiation through abbots and bishops. The records of Cluny Abbey contain dozens of cases where Eastertide armistices became permanent peace treaties, as the respite allowed war-weary lords to see alternatives to bloodshed. Even the Church's calendar became a subtle peacekeeping tool. By dotting the year with frequent feast days, St. John's in June, Michaelmas in September, All Saints in November, they created regular pauses in conflicts. Chroniclers noted how autumn campaigns often stalled as knights insisted on returning home for harvest festivals, only to find their enthusiasm for battle dampened by full barns and warm hearths. The rhythm of fasting and feasting imposed a discipline that standing armies lacked. Warriors who'd abstained together during Lent were less inclined to slaughter each other come Easter morning. This system wasn't foolproof. The infamous Christmas massacre of 1282, when Sicilian rebels slaughtered French occupiers during midnight mass, showed its fragility. Yet for every violation, there were hundreds of unrecorded successes, local feuds suspended for baptisms, rival mercenary companies sharing Easter communion, border guards exchanging holiday gifts across contested rivers. The Church's genius lay in recognizing that faith could create social pressure where royal decrees failed. A truce sworn on holy relics held more power than one signed on parchment, because it came with the weight of divine judgment and community expectation. Modern conflict resolution still borrows from this medieval playbook. United Nations ceasefires often align with religious holidays, from Ramadan to Christmas, while interfaith dialogues consciously recreate the neutral spaces of pilgrimage routes. But perhaps the most enduring lesson lies in the power of shared rituals to temporarily erase divisions, whether it's medieval knights laying down arms to honor a saint, or modern soldiers trading cigarettes across trenches on Christmas Eve. The calendar, it turns out, can be mightier than the sword. a roasted peacock reimagined as a golden phoenix, swan pies with gilded feathers, wine flowing from fountains shaped like mythical beasts. Medieval feasts weren't just meals, they were edible propaganda. Every dish at a lord's banquet table carried coded messages, from the quality of spices showing off trade connections to the sheer quantity of meat proving he could feed potential allies in wartime. When Edward I hosted his legendary Feast of the Swans in 1286, the real masterpiece wasn't the 30 cooked swans served with their beaks gilded in gold, it was the guest list. By seating Welsh nobles closer to the high table than his own English barons, he sent a silent promise of favor that no treaty could match. The seating arrangements alone could fill a diplomat's notebook. Lords who'd crossed swords might find themselves placed diagonally across from each other, close enough for conversation, but separated by a strategic candelabra. The chronicler Matthew Paris describes how at one tense feast, a French count and his Burgundian rival were deliberately seated beside the same roaring fireplace, the heat forcing them to shed armor and eventually their guardedness. Meanwhile, children of feuding families might share a trencher, a thick slab of stale bread serving as both plate and peace offering, learning from childhood that breaking bread literally meant softening hostilities. Then there were the gifts disguised as courses, presenting a rival with the ceremonial first bite of venison, a privilege normally reserved for family, created an unspoken debt. The accounts of the Duchy of Brittany record how a disputed border was settled not by battle, but by one lord sending another a barrel of Gascony wine with a note reading, "To be drunk when our lands meet in friendship." The recipient, caught between pride and thirst, chose the latter, and the boundary stones were moved peacefully the next spring. Even the choice of exotic ingredients served as subtle statecraft. Serving Moroccan dates at a German feast implied access to Mediterranean trade routes worth protecting. When the Holy Roman Emperor hosted Hungarian envoys with a pie containing live birds, a popular surprise dish, their startled laughter broke tensions over disputed silver mines. The message was clear: a ruler who could orchestrate such marvels at table could certainly manage larger surprises in war. Better to stay on his good side. But the true genius of these culinary summits lay in their biological alchemy. Modern studies show that sharing a meal synchronizes heart rates and boosts oxytocin, the bonding hormone. Medieval hosts intuitively understood this, stretching banquets to 6 or 7 hours to maximize the effect. By the time the spiced wine and honeyed figs arrived, former enemies would be loosening their belts along with their guard, trading battlefield stories like old comrades. The Chronicle of Joinville describes Crusader knights who'd fought viciously in the Holy Land, bonding over a shared love of Lebanese apricots during a truce feast, discovering common ground sweeter than any dessert. Of course, not all dining diplomacy succeeded. The infamous Peasants' Revolt in England began when a royal banquet's leftovers were thrown to dogs rather than given to starving commoners outside. Yet for every misstep there were countless quiet victories. A marriage brokered over shared plums, a trade dispute settled by competing oyster dishes, a blood feud paused when an heirloom recipe was exchanged. In an era when most political agreements were sealed with a handshake rather than parchment, the communal table became the ultimate contract. No signed document could compete with the memory of a rival lord's laughter as he fished a surprise almond from his stew, or the way his hand hesitated just slightly less when reaching for the salt cellar beside yours. The legacy of these edible accords lingers in every modern state dinner and business lunch. But today's negotiators could learn from medieval subtlety, where the strategic placement of a honey-glazed ham could do more than 100 PowerPoint slides. After all, it's hard to plot someone's downfall when your fingers are sticky from the same plum sauce, and your goblets keep clinking together in toasts. The unspoken rule still holds: never trust a leader who won't share his cheese. Music wasn't just background noise in those crowded medieval halls. It was a weapon of harmony, wielded by minstrels who knew their lute strings could do what swords could not. Picture this: two lords glowering at opposite ends of a torchlit chamber, hands hovering near daggers, until a skilled musician strikes up a ballad praising both their legendary grandfathers. Suddenly, shoulders relax, chins nod in recognition, and the air thickens with something far more dangerous than tension's shared pride. These troubadours weren't mere entertainers. They were emotional alchemists, transforming hostility into nostalgia with nothing but well-chosen chords. The Burgundian court took this concept to dazzling heights. Their composers crafted intricate piece motets, polyphonic masterpieces that wove together the heraldic melodies of feuding families into a single, soaring harmony. Imagine the effect: a Norman lord hearing his house anthem blend seamlessly with that of his Angevin rival, the music demonstrating in real time how discord could become unity. Chroniclers noted how Duke Philip the Good once diffused a heated argument between Flemish and French nobles by having his choir perform a motet where the Latin text "Dona nobis pacem," grant us peace, emerged note by note from the clashing themes. By the final cadence, the quarreling delegates were singing along, their voices unconsciously mirroring the resolution they couldn't find at the bargaining table. Dance played an equally cunning role in this soft diplomacy. Unlike modern freeform dancing, medieval circle dances like the carol demanded strict synchronization: hands joined, steps matched, bodies moving as one. Forcing enemies into these formations created a physical truce where their muscles learned cooperation before their minds consented to it. Records from 15th century Italy describe how the Este family would deliberately pair rivals in the bassadanza, a slow, stately dance requiring precise coordination. A man who has felt another's heartbeat through his palm finds it harder to later strike that same chest with a blade, observed one contemporary poet. The very act of breathing together, turning together, created a biological truce that often outlasted the music. Even the instruments themselves carried diplomatic weight. Harps symbolized reconciliation in Celtic traditions, their strings said to represent intertwined fates. When Welsh bards performed for English lords during rare truces, they'd carefully include both nations' folk tunes in their repertoire, a musical olive branch. The famed Parliament of Harps in 1421 saw musicians from warring Scottish clans improvising together, their spontaneous harmonies becoming a blueprint for their chieftains' negotiations the next day. The genius of this auditory peacekeeping lay in its subtlety. Unlike forced treaties or hostage exchanges, music and dance bypassed resistance by appealing to something deeper than reason. A mercenary captain might scoff at a priest's sermon on brotherhood, but when a fiddle tune from his childhood had him tapping his foot alongside his enemy, the walls crumbled without a word being spoken. The same primal instincts that make modern concertgoers sway together served medieval diplomats rhythm as the original universal language, older than any border dispute. This tradition's echoes still resonate in today's conflict zones, where music therapy bridges divides between war-traumatized children or rival gangs. But nothing quite matches the audacity of those medieval minstrels who walked into chambers thick with the threat of violence and walked out with coins in their pockets and temporary peace in their wake. Their legacy reminds us that sometimes the most potent diplomacy doesn't happen in treaty halls. It happens when enemies find themselves humming the same tune, or when old rivals discover their hands still remember how to clasp in time with the drum. In the flickering torchlight of a great hall, two lords who'd spent years raiding each other's lands now stood face to face, hands extended not with swords but with gifts. One offered a falcon bred from his finest lineage, its hood embroidered with silver thread. The other presented a drinking horn rimmed with amber, carved with scenes from their shared ancestral myths. This wasn't just courtesy, it was high-stakes diplomacy disguised as generosity. Every festival in medieval Europe thrummed with this elaborate dance of giving, where the exchange of treasures wove invisible threads of obligation stronger than any chainmail. The unspoken rules of these gift exchanges formed what historians call the economy of honor. When a lord accepted a valuable present, a Spanish stallion perhaps, or a Flemish tapestry, he entered into a silent contract. To attack the giver before reciprocating would violate codes of nobility that even the most ruthless warlords hesitated to break. The 12th century chronicler Lambert of Ardres describes how a single golden cup, gifted by the Count of Flanders to his Norman rival, delayed hostilities for 3 harvest seasons as both sides awaited the proper moment to answer with an equally magnificent gesture. Time bought with silver was time that could turn animosity into uneasy tolerance or even grudging respect. Nowhere was this system more finely tuned than in the Germanic ring-giving tradition. Noblemen would present elaborately crafted arm rings, some so heavy they required both hands to lift, inscribed with runes declaring friendship, but these weren't mere trinkets. The rings circulated like currency in an invisible bank of goodwill, their value measured not in gold weight but in years of peace secured. When Saxon Lord Widukind gifted Charlemagne a ring set with a sapphire said to calm stormy seas, he wasn't just flattering the Frankish king, he was binding him to pause his conquests long enough for counter-gifts to arrive. The strategy worked. Charlemagne's court reciprocated with 3 chests of Frankish weaponry, and the Saxon frontier remained quiet for 2 winters. The brilliance of this system lay in its flexibility. Gifts could be calibrated to the tension they needed to diffuse. A jeweled dagger might settle a minor border skirmish, while a whole ship filled with Baltic amber could pause a war. When the Duke of Burgundy and the Holy Roman Emperor teetered on the brink of conflict in 1415, their mutual exchange of astronomical clocks, precision instruments worth a castle's ransom, created a pause just long enough for papal mediators to intervene. The clocks weren't just bribes, they were symbolic peace treaties, their ticking mechanisms counting down not to war, but to the next obligatory exchange. But gifts also served as cunning psychological warfare. Presenting an enemy with something conspicuously valuable from your own lands, say Venetian glass or Persian silks, was a silent boast about your trade connections and wealth. The Welsh princes mastered this art, gifting English barons with intricately carved harp woods from forests those barons couldn't penetrate militarily. Each gift carried layers of meaning. The ivory chess set given to a rival wasn't just a game board, but a reminder that strategy could replace slaughter. This web of obligation extended beyond nobles to their entire retinues. When a lord distributed festival gifts to an enemy's knights, perhaps fine gloves or embroidered baldricks, he wasn't just being charitable. He was planting seeds of doubt in those warriors' loyalties. Why risk death attacking a man who might become your patron? The account books of medieval tours reveal how one clever viscount averted an invasion by sending casks of his famous walnut wine to the opposing army's captains months before harvest season. By the time the campaigning weather arrived, those captains were reportedly more interested in securing next year's vintage than besieging castles. Modern diplomacy still leans on this ancient playbook, from state dinners exchanging crystal to corporate gift baskets cementing deals. But medieval nobles understood something we often forget. The most binding contracts aren't always written on parchment. Sometimes they're etched into the hilt of a gifted dagger, woven into the threads of a presented banner, or lingering in the taste of a shared cask of wine reminders that honor, like fine metalwork, can bend before it breaks. While kings and nobles jousted in castle courtyards, Europe's rising merchant class was crafting its own brand of peacekeeping, one measured not in lances broken but in silks sold and spices weighed. The bustling trade fairs of cities like Bruges and Venice transformed market squares into unlikely diplomatic arenas, where the clink of coins often spoke louder than the clang of swords. Here, beneath striped awnings and between stalls overflowing with Florentine velvet and Levantine saffron, warring lords found themselves drawn into negotiations by the most persuasive force of all, profit. Merchant guilds, those early champions of globalization, understood something fundamental: war was terrible for business. A blocked trade route or a sacked caravan could erase fortunes overnight. So they became medieval peace brokers, funding lavish festivals where commerce and conflict resolution intertwined. The records of the Hanseatic League detail how their annual Lübeck fair featured not just haggling over Baltic amber, but discreet meetings between Scandinavian warlords in the Guildhall's upper chambers. The formula was simple: surround prickly nobles with the tangible benefits of peace luxuries they couldn't plunder, loans they couldn't secure elsewhere, and networks that would collapse if violence resumed. The sheer spectacle of these urban festivals worked subtle magic. A count arriving to dispute a border might find his anger cooling as he walked through streets hung with Flemish tapestries, past stages where acrobats tumbled and mummers performed allegories of reconciliation. The Venetian Censer Festival took this further, marrying the Doge to the sea in an elaborate ceremony that also served as cover for maritime boundary talks. Rival admirals who'd been burning each other's fleets would stand shoulder to shoulder on the Piazzetta, dazzled by the same fireworks display, a shared moment of wonder that made last season's raids feel suddenly petty. Contracts became the new treaties in these mercantile peace summits, where feudal oaths had failed, meticulously notarized trade agreements succeeded. The archives of Bruges contain a remarkable document from 1347. Two warring Flemish lords signed not a ceasefire, but a joint investment in a wool shipment from England. Their shared financial stake, and the guild's threat to blacklist both families if violence disrupted the trade, kept the peace longer than any royal decree. Similarly, the great Champagne fairs saw French dukes who'd been at each other's throats suddenly cooperating to protect merchant caravans, their mutual interest in tax revenue outweighing territorial squabbles. Even the festival menus served diplomatic purposes. Exotic foods became edible arguments for interconnection. Why fight over a strip of land when the same hands could be counting profits from imported Sicilian almonds or Cypriot wine? The account books of Genoese spice merchants show they deliberately offered credit to both sides in conflicts, creating webs of financial interdependence that made war economically unthinkable. A lord might ignore his bishop's pleas for peace, but he'd think twice before defaulting on loans backed by 12 Italian banking houses. This merchant-mediated peace had its limits, of course. The brutal sacks of Constantinople in 1204 and Antwerp in 1576 proved commerce couldn't always curb violence. Yet for centuries, these urban festivals provided something rare: neutral ground where enemies could recast themselves as partners, if only for a season. The legacy lingers in modern trade agreements and economic alliances, where mutual profit still does what armies cannot. Perhaps those medieval merchants grasped a timeless truth. It's hard to stay enemies with someone who knows the price of your spices, the quality of your wool, and the balance of your account. For every 10 festivals that smoothed tensions between medieval rivals, there was one that poured oil on the fire instead. Take that infamous night in 1440 Paris, when the Duke of Orleans hosted his so-called Dance of the Savages, a masquerade meant to celebrate a fragile truce in the Armagnac-Burgundian feud. The nobles arrived in elaborate costumes modeled after mythical wild men, their bodies covered in flax to resemble fur, their faces hidden behind grotesque wooden masks. What began as a pageant of reconciliation quickly unraveled when someone's torch brushed against the highly flammable costumes. Flames licked up the dancers' legs, panic erupted, and in the chaos, masks slipped to reveal identities better left concealed. Old accusations flew faster than the sparks, swords were drawn, and by dawn, the ballroom floor was slick with more than spilled wine. This catastrophic evening reveals the fine line medieval planners walked between peacemaking and provocation. Festivals required perfect calibration. Too much alcohol could loosen tongues at the wrong moment. Overly competitive games might reopen old wounds, and even guest lists demanded witchcraft-level precision. The chronicler in Garter de Monstrelet recounts how a 1520 tournament in Flanders nearly reignited a war because the host, trying to be fair, gave equal seating to two families whose feud had supposedly been settled. When one clan noticed their heraldic banners hung slightly lower than their rivals, they stormed out, interpreting the slight as a calculated insult. Cultural miscalculations proved especially dangerous. A well-intentioned feast for Scottish and English border lords went disastrously wrong when the host served roast boar, a delicacy in England, but in Scottish Gaelic tradition, a symbol of warlike aggression. The visiting Highlanders saw not hospitality but a veiled threat, and left before the first course was cleared. Similar misunderstandings plagued the Mediterranean, where Venetian merchants once tried to broker peace between Crusader factions by hosting an elaborate fish banquet during Lent. Unfortunately, the Greek delegates interpreted the absence of meat not as piety but as Venetian frugality, an insult that derailed negotiations for months. Even the most carefully orchestrated events could collapse under the weight of personal grudges. The Chronicle of the Counts of Foix tells of a 1480 joust where two knights, forbidden from actual combat due to a papal truce, used the tournament as proxy warfare. Their lances struck with such deliberate force that both died within hours, turning what should have been a spectacle of controlled violence into a very real double funeral. The shocked crowd dispersed not with cheers but with muttered vows of vengeance. Perhaps the greatest risk lay in the festival's temporary nature. Like a sandcastle built at low tide, these fragile truces couldn't always withstand the waves of returning reality. After the magnificent 1285 Feast of the Golden Spurs in Bruges, where Flemish and French nobles had exchanged gifts and oaths, everything unraveled within weeks when a French tax collector demanded payments from the same Flemish burghers who just toasted his king. The bonds of festival goodwill stretched thin when tested against ancient grievances and political realities, yet even these failures taught valuable lessons. The Savoyard dukes, after their disastrous 1511 Feast of the Dead, where guests arrived in funeral shrouds to symbolize burying grudges, only to start fistfights over seating, switched tactics. Their subsequent peace festivals featured fewer metaphors and more structured activities, guided hunts where cooperation was mandatory, or choir performances requiring daily rehearsals that forced interaction. Sometimes the difference between success and disaster came down to giving people something to do with their hands besides reaching for weapons. These cautionary tales remind us that shared joy is powerful but precarious medicine. A festival could lower defenses, but it couldn't erase decades of suspicion in one wine-soaked evening. The medieval world learned through bitter experience that merriment worked best as the beginning of peace, not the end, a first step requiring careful follow-through. For every alliance forged over roasted peacock, there was a shattered goblet signaling the opposite. The true skill lay in reading the room, knowing when to push rivals together, and when to let them breathe, lessons as relevant today in boardrooms and summit meetings as they were in torchlit great halls. While armored lords clashed in tournaments and kings postured at banquets, some of medieval Europe's most skilled peacemakers wore silk, not chainmail. Noblewomen, often dismissed as mere political pawns in marriage alliances, were in fact master architects of festival diplomacy, wielding influence through guest lists, seating charts, and carefully curated entertainment. Helena of Aquitaine, that towering figure of the 12th century, didn't just attend tournaments, she reinvented them. At her famed Courts of Love in Poitiers, knights competed not only in strength but in poetry and song, their violent rivalries sublimated into artistic one-upmanship. A Norman baron might hesitate to stab the man who just composed a flawless ballad about his sister's grace. The records of Helena's court reveal her subtle genius. By shifting the focus from martial prowess to courtly etiquette, she gave hot-tempered nobles something far more precious than battle glory, social prestige. Winning a joust earned fleeting cheers, but mastering the intricate rules of romantic devotion Helena promoted could elevate a family's status for generations. Chroniclers note how former enemies like the Lusignan and Plantagenet clans, who'd been slaughtering each other over Aquitaine's borders, suddenly found themselves vying to outdo one another in chivalric displays. The same men who'd burned villages now composed sonnets about spring blossoms, their aggression redirected into something resembling civilization. Across the Alps, Italian noblewomen perfected a different kind of soft power. Isabella d'Este's musical soirees in Mantua weren't just entertainment. They were negotiating tables with lute accompaniment. When territorial disputes between Ferrara and Venice grew heated, Isabella would invite both factions to a private concert featuring the latest compositions by Josquin des Prez. The intricate harmonies served as audible metaphors for political reconciliation, while the intimate setting allowed grievances to be aired without loss of face. Her famed study of antiquities, a private museum filled with Roman busts, became neutral ground where warring condottieri could admire artifacts together, their shared awe momentarily overriding old grudges. Burgundian duchesses like Margaret of York took this further, transforming entire wedding celebrations into elaborate peace processes. When Margaret married Charles the Bold in 1468, she didn't just blend two families, she wove together a fractured nobility. Her wedding feast seated English, French, and Burgundian lords in alternating chairs, forcing them to converse over dishes that combined all their culinary traditions. The Piece de Resistance, a gigantic sugar sculpture depicting Jason's Argonauts, a not-so-subtle hint about the rewards of collaboration. For weeks after, chroniclers reported former enemies using phrases like, "as we agreed at the ducal table," during negotiations. These women leveraged societal expectations to their advantage. While men were expected to be publicly unyielding in disputes, noblewomen could employ feminine arts, music, poetry, even dance as covert diplomatic tools. A well-timed gift of embroidered gloves might carry more weight than a bishop's sermon when smoothing tensions between border lords. The Countess of Provas's tradition of hosting joint embroidery sessions for rival ladies created networks of influence that often proved stronger than their husbands' treaties. As one troubadour song from the period put it, "Her needle threads silk as she threads peace between our houses." The legacy of these feminine peacemakers lingers in unexpected places. Modern conflict resolution techniques increasingly emphasize shared cultural experiences, from collaborative art projects to joint musical performances, echoing Isabella d'Este's concerts centuries later. Elena's blending of competition and artistry finds its parallel in today's cultural exchange programs that bring adversaries together through sports or theater. What these medieval women understood, and what we're still relearning, is that sometimes the most binding treaties aren't signed in ink, but in the shared memory of a perfect harmony, a breathtaking verse, or the scent of rosewater drifting through a torchlit garden where enemies once stood, uncertain whether to clasp hands or draw swords. Golden pheasants embroidered on velvet, banners fluttering with quartered crests, even the colors of the table linens. Nothing in a medieval festival was ever just decoration. Every visual element served as a silent herald, broadcasting messages more potent than any herald's proclamation. When the Duke of Burgundy hosted that legendary Festival of the Pheasant in 1389, the real masterpiece wasn't the gilded bird centerpieces or the wine fountains. It was the sea of identical enamel badges glinting on every noble's chest. Burgundian and French rivals who'd been slaughtering each other's troops weeks earlier now wore the same token, a pheasant with the motto, "To my delight," in intertwined French and Flemish. At a glance, the message was clear today: we are not enemies but fellow celebrants under the same symbolic banner. Heraldry became the visual language of these fragile truces. Normally, a lord's coat of arms declared his lineage, alliances, and territorial claims like a portable battlefield. But festival organizers played with these rules like master chess players. The cleverest trick, impalement, splitting a shield vertically to display two families' arms side by side, a silent announcement of reconciliation. When the feuding houses of York and Lancaster did this at the 1265 London tournament, even illiterate peasants in the crowd grasped the significance. The white rose and red now shared the same space, if only on painted parchment. Color schemes transformed entire events into living allegories. The 1210 Festival of the Golden Tree in Bruges saw streets draped in alternating stripes of Flemish black and gold and French blue and white, a visual representation of intertwined fates. Chroniclers noted how lords who'd refused to speak for years found themselves standing beneath canopies where their colors merged into new patterns, a subliminal suggestion that old divisions could be reimagined. Even flowers carried coded meanings. White lilies for peace, red roses for passion turned from war to courtly love, ivy for bonds that couldn't be broken. The strategic placement of symbols could gently pressure stubborn nobles into compliance. At the 1422 Frankfurt Reichstag, Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund seated electors beneath a tapestry depicting the Last Supper, with each prince's heraldic beast woven into the apostles' robes. The implication was unmistakable. Just as Christ's followers overcame differences, so too must you. One stubborn margrave reportedly spent the feast avoiding looking upward, only to find his personal emblem, a snarling boar, stitched onto his dinner napkin. Some festivals took this symbolism to breathtaking extremes. The 1295 Feast of the Swan saw English and Scottish nobles releasing hundreds of paired swans into a moat, their wings dyed with temporary tints that blended as they swam. By sunset, the water swirled with new colors, a poetic demonstration of how temporary cooperation could create unexpected beauty. Even the food participated. Pies baked with alternating dough strips symbolized interwoven destinies, while dual-colored jellies showed separate entities capable of fusion. Yet this visual diplomacy demanded perfect calibration. Get the symbolism wrong, and a well-intentioned gesture could ignite fresh conflict. The infamous peacock disaster of 1311 occurred when a French duke served the bird with its tail fanned, a gesture of respect at home, but in his Burgundian guest's tradition, an insult implying vanity. The resulting brawl left 3 nobles dead and the banquet hall in flames. Modern event planners still borrow from this medieval playbook. Summit meeting backdrops with carefully balanced flags, corporate logos merged for partnerships, even the color psychology of protest movements, all descend from those festival organizers who understood that sometimes the quickest path to peace isn't through words, but through symbols that bypass resistance to speak directly to the heart. A shared banner, a joint emblem, or even just matching festival ribbons could whisper what treaties shouted, and often the whisper carried further. The moment a drinking horn passed between enemies, something remarkable happened, a transformation as potent as any alchemist's brew. In the flickering firelight of a Viking longhouse or the smoky grandeur of a Norman feast hall, that shared vessel became more than a container for ale or mead. It turned into a living contract, its contents sealing promises with every sip. Norse sagas tell of Symbol ceremonies where warriors from rival clans would clasp the same gilded horn, their beards dripping with honeyed mead as they swore oaths so binding that breaking them meant eternal shame. The trick, these pledges weren't whispered in private, they were roared before dozens of witnesses, their words echoing off rafters hung with battle trophies. A lord might later regret his generosity, but he'd think twice before violating a vow made drunk and loud in front of his entire warband. Consider the intricate choreography of a Saxon peace toast. The host would rise first, draining a horn to prove it wasn't poisoned, then refill it with exaggerated care before passing it clockwise, always clockwise, following the sun's path for luck. As the vessel moved from hand to hand, each recipient was expected to meet the gaze of every person present, locking their promise into collective memory. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes how King Alfred used this very ritual to pacify Danish chieftains, turning their own drinking customs against them. By the time the horn completed its circuit, even the most hardened raiders found themselves bound by an invisible web of obligation thicker than mead foam. The French refined this practice into high art with their vin d'honneur ceremonies. When Burgundian and Armagnac nobles toasted with twin-handled cups at the 1430 Treaty of Arras, the design forced them to grip the same vessel simultaneously, a physical manifestation of temporary unity. Chroniclers noted how fingers that had once curled around sword hilts now brushed against each other on polished silver, the intimacy as deliberate as any treaty clause. These weren't casual drinks, they were liquid handshakes with the alcohol serving a calculated purpose. A sober man might pass every word for loopholes, but a pleasantly inebriated one could be coaxed into concessions he'd never make cold sober. Welsh bards took the symbolism further, carving drinking horns with interlocking patterns that only made sense when two rivals' vessels were placed side by side, a visual metaphor for how their fates were now intertwined. The horn of Gwyrgwyd from the 12th century still bears runes declaring that whoever shared its contents would share prosperity. Archaeologists found a similar artifact near the Scottish border, its rim notched with tally marks suggesting it had been used to seal dozens of truces over generations. Of course, this liquid diplomacy carried risks. The Icelandic Egil saga recounts how a poorly timed toast nearly reignited a blood feud when one clansman misinterpreted the angle at which his rival tilted his horn, a perceived slight that required 3 more rounds of drinking to smooth over. At the infamous Drunken Parliament of 1516, Scottish lords botched a critical succession agreement because the scribe was too inebriated to record the terms accurately. Yet for every mishap, there were countless successes, moments when shared ale washed away grudges better than any sermon. When Byzantine emperors received barbarian emissaries, they always served the strongest wine first, knowing the quicker tongues loosened, the sooner real negotiations could begin. The legacy of these rituals lingers in every clinked glass at modern state dinners, every champagne toast at business mergers, but we've lost the raw potency of those medieval ceremonies, where alcohol wasn't just social lubricant but social glue, where the act of drinking together created bonds enforceable by honor rather than law. In an age without notaries, the foam on a beer horn might as well have been sealing wax, and the warmth in one's belly stood surety for promises no parchment could match. Beneath their motley caps and jingling bells, medieval court jesters wielded a power no armored knight could match, the license to speak truth through laughter. These sharp-tongued entertainers occupied a unique space in the rigid feudal hierarchy, their exaggerated antics and barbed songs serving as social pressure valves at tense festival gatherings. Where diplomats tiptoed around sensitive topics, jesters like King Henry VIII's Will Sommers could mock their master's vanity or war, mongering to uproarious applause, exposing the absurdity of noble feuds without triggering violence. The secret lay in their dual role as both entertainer and truth-teller. Dressed in garish colors that signaled their outsider status, jesters performed a delicate dance of satire, pushing boundaries just far enough to provoke thought but stopping short of genuine insult. Records from the Burgundian court describe how the jester Chicot once halted a brewing fight between two barons by mimicking their posturing with a pair of inflatable pig bladders, reducing the entire hall to helpless laughter. In that moment of shared mirth, the nobles' quarrel suddenly seemed as ridiculous as the parody, and the tension dissolved. Some jesters ascended to become unlikely peace brokers. The legendary Tribulate, favorite of King Francis I, famously mediated between France and the Holy Roman Empire through humor. When negotiations between Francis and Emperor Charles V stalled over territorial disputes, Tribulate staged a mock battle using sausages as swords and a pie as the contested city. His edible allegory, with both monarchs conquering slices of the same pastry, helped reframe their conflict as petty squabbling. The subsequent treaty included an unusual clause guaranteeing Tribulate safe passage between both courts, recognizing his unique diplomatic value. Festivals provided the perfect stage for this risky comedy. Amid the chaotic energy of jugglers, musicians, and dancing bears, a jester could deliver cutting observations that would earn anyone else a dungeon cell. The German Shrovetide plays took this further, with costumed fools acting out exaggerated versions of local disputes, showing warring guilds or feuding families how childish their battles appeared to outsiders. Like Shakespeare's wise fools centuries later, these performers wrapped uncomfortable truths in absurdity, making them palatable precisely because they were ridiculous. The tradition traces back to ancient roots. Norse sagas tell of Thulia who could critique kings through verse, while Byzantine emperors kept scleroi to mock court pretensions. But medieval Europe perfected the art, institutionalizing the jester's role as a necessary irritant. Their immunity stemmed from an unspoken contract. Laughter created enough psychological distance for lords to recognize their own follies without losing face. When Duke Philip of Burgundy's jester presented him with a mirror instead of the expected joke during a tense standoff with rebels, the message was clear: the real folly lay in the Duke's own stubbornness. Philip reportedly laughed, then lifted the siege, yet this system demanded exquisite precision. The line between therapeutic mockery and lese majesty was perilously thin. The fate of jesters who crossed it, like the unfortunate who joked about Queen Isabella's rumored affairs and found himself catapulted over castle walls, served as grim reminders of the risks. The most successful fools mastered the art of plausible deniability, couching their sharpest observations in layers of wordplay and double meanings. Their rhymes might praise a lord's generosity while their gestures mimicked counting coins, letting the audience connect the dots themselves. Modern comedians and political satirists owe much to these medieval precursors. but few enjoy the same institutionalized license to provoke. What made festival jesters truly revolutionary was their sanctioned subversion, proof that even the most rigid hierarchies need voices that can, however briefly, turn the world upside down. In an era when a misplaced word could start wars, laughter became the safest weapon for peace. The turning of the seasons didn't just mark time in medieval Europe, it orchestrated peace. Like a celestial choreographer, the festival calendar ensured that just as tensions between rival lords reached their peak, a holiday arrived to hit pause. May Day, with its flower crowns and dancing around the maypole, wasn't merely a celebration of spring, it was a diplomatic deadline. Feuding barons knew that by the time the first hawthorn blossoms appeared, they'd be expected to lay down arms and join the communal revelry. The same principle held for Midsummer's Eve, when bonfires lit up disputed borderlands, their glow visible from both sides of contested territories. In that flickering light, enemies became neighbors again, sharing ale and stories as the solstice's magic temporarily overrode old grudges. Winter's approach brought its own rhythm of reconciliation. As days shortened and harvests ended, the looming Christmas truce, backed by the church's stern threats of excommunication, forced even the most belligerent warlords to sheath their swords. The Chronicle of Jocelyn of Brakelon describes how Suffolk manors that had been locked in a bitter mill dispute all autumn suddenly found themselves cooperating to gather Yule logs in December, the shared labor smoothing over months of hostility. There was an unspoken understanding that certain conflicts simply weren't permitted to spill over into sacred seasons, creating natural cooling-off periods that prevented feuds from reaching the point of no return. This cyclical peacekeeping worked because it leveraged humanity's deepest rhythms. Just as farmers relied on the predictable return of planting and harvest, warriors came to depend on these regular respites. The 1285 records of the Duchy of Brabant show knights scheduling raids around festival dates not out of piety, but because they knew garrisons would be undermanned during celebrations. Yet often, those same raiders would find themselves drawn into the festivities instead, their weapons forgotten as the scent of roasting chestnuts and the sound of carols worked their ancient magic. The brilliance of this system lay in its inevitability. Unlike negotiated truces that could be delayed or debated, seasonal festivals arrived with the certainty of sunrise. A lord might resist a bishop's plea for peace in October, but when Advent began, even the proudest noble had to conform or risk social ostracism. The same principle applied to local customs. Swabian villages might feud over fishing rights all summer, but come Martinmas in November, the sharing of the ceremonial goose dinner became non-negotiable. These weren't just traditions, they were societal circuit breakers, preventing conflicts from overheating by building in regular resets. Modern life has lost much of this built-in rhythm. Our conflicts simmer year-round without the natural pressure valves of communal celebration. Yet echoes remain in holiday ceasefires observed by warring nations, in the way neighborhood disputes often soften during festive seasons. The medieval world understood something we've forgotten. Peace isn't just the absence of war, but the presence of shared moments that remind us of our common humanity. Their calendar didn't just tell time, it told people when to stop fighting, when to come together, and when to let the turning of the earth do what swords and treaties could not. When Edward III clasped that legendary blue garter around his rival's knee at Windsor Castle in 1344, he wasn't just accessorizing, he was performing political alchemy. The Order of the Garter's annual festival transformed bitter competitors into sworn brothers, their rivalries sublimated into elaborate pageantry. Picture the scene, French and English knights who'd been trying to slaughter each other at Crécy mere months earlier, now processing side by side in identical azure robes, their swords sheathed as they swore oaths on saintly relics. This was chivalry weaponized for peace, where honor became a cage strong enough to restrain even the most ambitious warlords. What made these knightly orders so effective was their fusion of spirituality and spectacle. A simple handshake might be broken, but an oath sworn before the high altar at Canterbury while wearing the Virgin Mary's colors, that bound a man's soul as much as his word. The chronicler Jean Froissart describes how Garter knights who quarreled were compelled to reconcile during the annual feast, not through force but by the crushing weight of ritual. One recalcitrant lord, forced to share the ceremonial love cup with his enemy while the entire order watched, reportedly groaned that he'd rather face 100 French lances than such shameful harmony. The genius lay in the order's exclusivity. Unlike open festivals where nobles could drift in and out, these brotherhoods created year-round accountability. A knight expelled from the Garter for breaking truce wouldn't just lose prestige, he'd forfeit his place in the afterlife's envisioned celestial roster. The Order's records show meticulous accounting of every broken vow, with fines ranging from jeweled spurs for minor slights to entire suits of armor for graver offenses. At the 1367 gathering, when the Earl of Warwick arrived late due to raiding a fellow member's lands, he found his usual seat replaced by a donkey, a humiliation that secured his prompt apology and restitution. These weren't isolated cases. Across Europe, knightly orders turned seasonal festivals into enforcement mechanisms. The Burgundian Order of the Golden Fleece held its chapter meetings during Pentecost, deliberately overlapping with the Church's mandated truce period. Members who violated the peace faced not just excommunication, but the surreal punishment of having their personal heraldry defaced in all order artworks, a medieval version of being digitally erased from group photos. In Spain, the Order of Santiago's summer festival featured a bizarre ritual where feuding knights had to jointly hold a single sword while a choir sang hymns about unity, their physical struggle to maintain grip mirroring the effort required to sustain peace. The Windsor Festival of 1344 became the gold standard for this knightly diplomacy. Edward III cleverly scheduled it just before campaigning season, ensuring his fractious nobles were freshly bound by oaths when they marched on France. The week-long event mixed sacred ceremonies with raucous feasting, one moment knights kneeling to receive communion together, the next competing to compose the bawdiest drinking songs about their former enemies. This emotional whiplash was deliberate. Shared vulnerability in the chapel followed by shared laughter in the hall created bonds that mere treaties couldn't match. Modern institutions from country clubs to corporate retreats unconsciously echo these medieval models, though few recognize their origins. The Garter's legacy survives in subtle ways, the way exclusive societies still use shared rituals to smooth rivalries, how annual conferences force competitors into temporary collegiality. But we've lost the spiritual stakes that made those oaths unbreakable. When a medieval knight swore on his garter to keep the peace, he wasn't just risking social embarrassment, he was gambling with his immortal soul. That's a deterrent no modern networking event can replicate. War drained coffers faster than any festival could, a truth medieval lords understood all too well. While raising an army required emptying treasuries on mercenaries, siege engines, and supply trains, hosting a grand tournament or feast merely meant investing in wine, musicians, and a few prize stallions. The accounting scrolls of 14th century Burgundy reveal the stark math. Outfitting 100 knights for a month of campaigning cost roughly the same as staging a week-long festival with jousts, mystery plays, and enough roasted swans to feed half the nobility. Small wonder shrewd rulers increasingly saw pageantry as the better bargain. Take that pivotal moment in 1406 when Frankfurt's autumn fair transformed from a simple marketplace into an impromptu peace conference. Two Rhineland princes who'd been mobilizing troops over a disputed silver mine suddenly realized their soldiers would earn more profit guarding spice merchants than dying in some muddy field. Contemporary ledgers show how the Count Palatine redirected his war chest to purchase 27 bolts of Venetian damask and a cask of Cypriot wine instead of crossbow bolts. His rival, the Margrave of Mason, went further, renting out his knights as premium escorts for Italian bankers' gold shipments. By fair's end, both rulers had not only avoided financial ruin but gained new trade partners, proving commerce could conquer where swords had failed. The Hanseatic League perfected this economic peacekeeping. Their network of trading posts from Novgorod to London operated on one ironclad rule: violence was bad for business. When feuding Scandinavian kings threatened to disrupt Baltic herring routes in 1392, Hanseatic merchants didn't send troops. They sponsored a fisherman's festival that brought all parties to the negotiating table. The genius touch, serving dishes prepared from fish caught in waters both sides claimed, subtly demonstrating how cooperation could fill bellies where conflict left nets empty. Account books from Lübeck show the event cost less than one warship's upkeep, yet secured 3 years of unbroken trade. Even the church got in on this fiscal diplomacy. Bishops struggling to prevent bloodshed between French nobles during the Albigensian Crusade didn't just preach peace, they crunched numbers. Surviving manuscripts from Carcassonne Abbey detail how clergy presented warring barons with itemized lists comparing crusade tithes against potential festival revenues. One particularly persuasive monk calculated that the indulgences granted for funding a Corpus Christi procession would outweigh any earthly glory from battlefield victories. The gamble worked. 3 lords famously diverted their siege funds to commission a golden monstrance instead. Its radiance meant to outshine martial pride. The most successful festivals turned economics into spectacle itself. At the 1422 Peace of Arras celebrations, bankers literally built a stage where actors performed allegorical scenes using real account books and coin scales. In one memorable tableau, 2 armored knights struggled to lift a chest labeled war debt, while merchants beside them effortlessly stacked bags of market profits. The message transcended language barriers, a lesson the Holy Roman Empire later emulated by having mint masters demonstrate coins striking during truce negotiations. The rhythmic hammer blows underscoring prosperity's melody. Of course, this system wasn't foolproof. The same Medici account books that record lavish spending on Florence's patron saint festivals also note loans to fund mercenary companies. But the broader pattern holds. Wherever trade routes thickened, festival calendars grew crowded, and battlefields fell quiet. The parchment rolls of medieval Europe tell a quiet revolution, not in ink but in numbers. Column after column of wine purchases, minstrel fees, and prize purses quietly outpacing entries for armor repairs and ransom payments. In the end, even the most battle-hardened warlord couldn't ignore the ledger's verdict. Dancing cost less than dying, and a well-timed feast could fatten purses where war only drained them. Nothing disarmed hardened nobles faster than the sight of their own children holding hands with former enemies' heirs. At the 1497 London Midsummer Watch, the heirs of the Percy and Neville families, whose fathers had spent decades spilling blood over northern England's borders, marched side by side wearing matching wreaths of white roses. Their small hands clutched the same silk banner, their high-pitched voices singing the same hymn, while battle-scarred barons watched with unexpectedly moist eyes. This was peace-building at its most disarming, where the innocence of children became a political strategy sharper than any dagger. Royal courts across Europe soon recognized the power of these youthful ambassadors. The Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella famously dressed their infants in fabrics woven from both Castilian gold and Aragonese red, turning every cradle into a living tapestry of unity. When the Habsburg Prince Philip the Fair visited England in 1406, his toddler daughter Margaret was given the ceremonial role of presenting flowers to Henry VII's sons, a gesture so disarming that chroniclers noted hardened diplomats suddenly speaking in unusually soft tones. There's something primal about children's ability to bypass adult hostility. Medieval rulers harnessed this instinct with calculated precision. Festival organizers developed entire theatrical roles for noble children as peace symbols. The German Kinderspiel tradition saw rival lords' offspring performing allegorical plays where they defeat not each other, but abstract forces like winter or dishonor. In Burgundy, young pages from feuding families were paired to carry joint heraldic banners so heavy they had to cooperate just to lift them. The physical act of shared effort, those small shoulders straining together under embroidered silk, created bonds no treaty could replicate. One poignant account describes a Norman boy and his Breton counterpart, after weeks rehearsing a peace pageant, refusing to part when their fathers resumed hostilities, clinging to each other until forcibly separated. The Church amplified this strategy through liturgical theater. During the Feast of the Holy Innocents, normally rigid social hierarchies inverted as children temporarily assumed adult roles. A lord's son might play the bishop blessing his father's rival, or a merchant's daughter crown a noble heir with flowers, powerful visual metaphors for a reordered world. Records from Canterbury Cathedral show these performances frequently preceded successful peace negotiations, as hardened warriors found their stubbornness melting under the gaze of earnest young faces. But this innocence was carefully curated. Every ribbon in a princeling's hair, every verse in their song carried deliberate symbolism. When the future Henry VIII, then just a golden-haired boy of 9, danced with French princesses at the 1492 Treaty of Etaples celebrations, his steps were choreographed to trace the borders of contested territories. The message was unmistakable. Here was a generation that might inherit resolved conflicts rather than perpetuate them. Chroniclers noted how French and English lords who'd spent the banquet glowering at each other were suddenly leaning forward with identical proud parent expressions when the children performed. The darker side of this strategy emerged when festivals ended. Those same children who'd exchanged gifts during Christmas pageants might grow up to lead armies against each other, their childhood bonds strained by adult politics. Yet for brief moments under the festival torches, they offered something rare, a glimpse of a world where bloodlines blended instead of clashing, where the next generation might laugh together instead of drawing swords. In an era when most political messages were delivered through heralds and charters, children became living proclamations, their very presence a silent argument for peace too heartfelt to ignore. The temporary palaces that sprang up for medieval festivals weren't just extravagant party venues, they were masterclasses in psychological architecture, designed to reshape conflict through every carved beam and draped tapestry. Take the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, where England's Henry VIII and France's Francis I erected a shimmering city of tents and pavilions in a contested stretch of land between their kingdoms. These weren't mere camps, they were carefully constructed neutral territories, their layouts forcing former enemies into unavoidable proximity while maintaining just enough symbolic balance to soothe fragile egos. The central chapel, with its alternating English and French heraldic motifs, became a physical manifestation of their forced harmony, a space where both monarchs could kneel at the same altar without either appearing subordinate. What made these ephemeral structures so effective was their temporary nature. Unlike permanent palaces laden with centuries of partisan history, these festival grounds had no baggage. The dining hall where rivals broke bread hadn't witnessed their grandfathers' feuds. The theater where they applauded the same play hadn't stored weapons against their ancestors. This blank slate quality allowed for subtle manipulations of space that would have been impossible at home. At the 1285 Festival of the Golden Spurs, Flemish architects built a banquet tent with two identical entrances, one facing the French delegation's camp, the other the Flemish, so neither side could claim precedence in seating. The ceiling beams were painted with intertwined fleurs de lis and Flemish lions, a visual reminder that this was territory where old rules didn't apply. Shared structures also created unavoidable moments of intimacy. The famous peace staircases, found in many festival grounds, forced opposing nobles to ascend side by side, their shoulders nearly touching as they navigated deliberately narrow steps. Bathhouses built over natural springs became unlikely negotiation chambers where the act of sharing warm water lowered defenses along with dirt. Even the latrines played a role. Their communal design and lack of partitions meant that proud lords who'd never deigned to speak at court found themselves making awkward small talk while attending to nature's call. Theatre pavilions took this concept furthest, their stages becoming microcosms of ideal societies. When the Duke of Burgundy commissioned a rotating platform for his 1482 Peace Festival, audiences saw French and Burgundian actors performing alternate scenes until the finale, when the mechanism spun to reveal both groups merged into a single tableau. The physical shock of that transformation, the gasp as two worlds became one before the crowd's eyes, often did more to shift attitudes than months of diplomatic letters. Similarly, the Temple of Concord, erected for the 1415 Council of Constance, featured mirrored walls that multiplied the image of each attendee into infinity, a visceral lesson in how individual actions rippled through Christendom. Yet perhaps the most ingenious architectural trick was the strategic use of thresholds. Gateways between festival zones were designed as psychological reset points, arched portals hung with fresh herbs to cleanse the air, or floored with contrasting tiles that forced visitors to mind their step. Chroniclers noted how quarreling lords who crossed these transitional spaces often paused mid-argument, their bodies responding to the subconscious cue that they were entering new social territory. The accounts of the 1298 Lubeck reconciliation describe a veil gate, hung with lightweight silks that brushed against faces as nobles passed through, the tactile sensation interrupting old thought patterns like a physical comma in their hostility. These temporary cities ultimately proved more durable than their canvas walls suggested. Long after the silken pavilions were packed away, the shared memories of those spaces lingered, of walking the same garden paths, admiring the same tapestries, or getting lost in identical corridor mazes. In an age when most treaties were sealed with wax that could melt, the architects of medieval festivals built their peace in something far more resistant to time, the human capacity to associate places with emotions. A lord might later dismiss the promises made at a negotiation table, but he'd struggle to forget the visceral experience of standing shoulder to shoulder with his rival beneath a chapel dome painted like the night sky, both their faces upturned in identical wonder. The Prague coronation of 1458 wasn't just a celebration, it was a carefully scripted illusion performed for an audience on the brink of revolt. As Bohemian and Hungarian nobles paraded through the streets in matching crimson robes, Their forced smiles and synchronized gestures broadcast a message more potent than any royal decree: unity where none truly existed. Behind the gilded pageantry, King George of Podebrady knew his throne depended on this spectacle. The recent Hussite wars had left the kingdom fractured, and the scent of rebellion hung thicker in the air than the incense swirling around the cathedral. So he orchestrated a masterclass in political theater, choreographing every embrace between rival lords, every harmonious choir performance, to convince his subjects that stability had returned. This was peace as performance art, the coronation banquet centerpiece, a massive sugar sculpture depicting Bohemia's patron saint handing a crown to Hungary's, wasn't just decorative. It was edible propaganda, designed to be dismantled and consumed by the very nobles whose rivalry it claimed to resolve. Chroniclers noted how the king deliberately seated feuding families at tables shaped like interlocking puzzle pieces, forcing physical proximity while minstrels sang ballads about shared history. The message was clear: dissent would now mean rejecting not just the crown, but the carefully crafted narrative of reconciliation served alongside the roast peacock. Other monarchs soon adopted these tactics. When Louis XI of France faced restive burghers in 1461, he staged a festival of the common good, where tax collectors and merchants literally danced together in allegorical pageants. The centerpiece, a mock battle between actors representing grievance and conciliation, with the latter inevitably victorious. Town records show the event cost less than a month's military garrisoning, yet postponed serious uprisings for nearly 2 years. Similarly, the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella used Seville's annual Corpus Christi procession to showcase conquered Granada's emirs walking peacefully behind Christian knights, a living diorama of submission that deterred rebellion more effectively than garrisons. The genius of these festivals lay in their plausible deniability. Unlike heavy-handed decrees, they allowed audiences to willingly suspend disbelief. A peasant watching Hungarian nobles toast their Bohemian counterparts might cynically know it was performance, but the sheer scale created a cognitive dissonance. Could such elaborate harmony really be fake? This psychological tightrope walk gave rulers breathing room to address underlying tensions. The accounts of Milanese ambassador Gian Pietro Arrivabene reveal how Duke Galeazzo Maria Sforza deliberately leaked rumors of impending festivals to restless cities, buying months of calm simply through anticipation of coming revelry. Religious imagery supercharged this propaganda. The 1282 Feast of the Holy Lance in Nuremberg saw Emperor Rudolf staging a miraculous rediscovery of a sacred relic, conveniently timed to overshadow guild protests. For weeks beforehand, preachers saturated the populace with visions of divine favor resting on obedient cities. When the lance was found during a carefully staged excavation witnessed by hundreds, the subsequent procession became a loyalty test. Who would dare rebel under the gaze of a saint's artifact? Similar strategies birthed traditions like Venice's marriage to the sea, where the Doge's annual ring toss into the Adriatic symbolized both dominion and benevolence, a dual message that kept maritime republics compliant. Yet this spectacle-based rule had its vulnerabilities. The same crowds that oohed at fireworks could turn when promises of peace rang hollow. The 1437 London Midsummer Watch collapsed into riots when citizens recognized the reconciled noblemen in the pageant as their actual oppressors. More dangerously, festivals created expectations once people grew accustomed to bread and circuses. Withholding them became politically perilous. The Burgundian dukes learned this the hard way when budget cuts to their famed Lille festivals in 1488 sparked unrest that years of lavishness had failed to prevent. In the end, these theatrical peace offerings worked precisely because they appealed to humanity's deepest instincts: The craving for narrative, the comfort of ritual, the hope that if enemies could pretend harmony long enough, they might eventually feel it. Modern leaders still employ these tactics, from carefully staged handshakes at summits to national holidays, reinforcing founding myths. But none match the audacity of those medieval monarchs who understood that sometimes the most effective way to govern isn't from a throne, but from a festival stage where every jest, every procession, every gilded prop whispers the same seductive lie: all is well. The slow unraveling of festival diplomacy began with the rise of something far more mundane than feasts or jousts: bureaucracy. As kingdoms transformed into centralized states during the 16th and 17th centuries, the messy personal rivalries that once required elaborate pageantry to resolve were gradually replaced by something colder but more efficient: paperwork. The 1648 Peace of Westphalia didn't just end the 30 Years' War, it sounded the death knell for an entire system of conflict resolution. Why host a months-long tournament to settle territorial disputes when a clerk with a quill could draw a border in ink? The shift was seismic. Diplomacy moved from torchlit halls to chancelleries, from oaths sworn on relics to signatures notarized by functionaries. Yet the transition wasn't immediate or absolute. Festivals didn't vanish overnight, they simply lost their teeth. The same tournaments that once prevented wars became mere entertainment, their rules standardized to the point of sterility. Where Edward III had used the Order of the Garter to bind warlords together, Elizabeth I's Accession Day tilts were primarily propaganda, their political edges dulled by spectacle. The accounts of the French court under Louis XIV reveal the change in stark relief. His lavish fêtes at Versailles still dazzled, think fireworks over the Grand Canal, or Molière's plays performed in garden grottos, but their purpose had narrowed. These were displays of absolutism, not negotiation tables draped in silk. The Peace of Westphalia crystallized this evolution. Its treaties didn't just redraw maps, they enshrined the concept of state sovereignty, replacing the patchwork of personal loyalties that festivals had once managed. A prince's word was no longer enough. Now, every clause required seals, witnesses, and precise legal terminology. The imperial diet of the Holy Roman Empire, where feuding nobles had once settled scores over roast boar and spiced wine, became a dry debating chamber. Even the church's influence waned. The Truce of God held no power against standing armies funded by national treasuries rather than feudal obligations. But traces of the old ways lingered in unexpected places. The Congress of Vienna in 1815, though ostensibly a modern diplomatic conference, borrowed medieval festival logic at every turn. Delegates didn't just negotiate in meeting rooms, they waltzed together at nightly balls, their carefully choreographed social interactions smoothing over daytime disputes. Tsar Alexander I even revived the ancient tradition of joint oath-taking, having rulers swear on the same Bible used at the Peace of Westphalia. The message was clear: some truths are better felt than notarized. Today's state banquets and cultural exchanges carry faint echoes of those medieval gatherings. When world leaders share a toast in the White House's East Room, they're participating in a ritual that would feel familiar to Henry VIII's courtiers, albeit with better sanitation. Modern Olympic Games, with their emphasis on temporary truces and neutral competition, owe more to 12th century tournaments than we might admit. Even corporate retreats, where rival executives bond over trust falls and whiskey tastings, unwittingly mimic the Burgundian duke's strategy of mixing business with carefully calibrated pleasure. The difference lies in stakes. Where medieval festivals could halt wars, their modern descendants rarely rise above photo opportunities. Yet perhaps there's wisdom in remembering what we've lost, a time when peace wasn't just brokered across conference tables, but forged in the shared heat of a crowded dance floor or over a goblet passed hand to hand. In an age of digital diplomacy and Zoom summits, we might ask whether something essential has slipped away: the understanding that sometimes the surest path to accord isn't through clauses and subclauses, but through the primal alchemy of breaking bread together under the same roaring hearth. The medieval lords who turned jousting lists into negotiation tables might seem distant from modern diplomacy, but their strategies pulse through today's peace-building efforts in surprising ways. Take the 2018 Winter Olympics, where North and South Korean athletes marched under a unified flag, a moment that felt unprecedented to the world, yet would have been intimately familiar to a 15th-century Burgundian duke. The same principles that once paused wars for tournament season now shape everything from cultural exchange programs to corporate mergers, the understanding that shared joy can disarm where rhetoric fails. Modern psychology confirms what medieval planners intuited: rituals and symbols bypass rational resistance, creating neural pathways of connection. When Cold War adversaries Nixon and Khrushchev famously debated in a model American kitchen at the 1959 Moscow exhibition, the mundane act of examining appliances together softened ideological divides far more effectively than formal talks. Like medieval lords bonding over falconry or chess, these moments of shared focus trigger what neuroscientists call neural coupling, synchronizing brain activity between individuals. The ping-pong diplomacy between the U.S. and China in the 1970s operated on this same principle, transforming a ping-pong ball into a more potent peace tool than any treaty draft. Corporate conflict resolution has quietly adopted these ancient tactics. Tech giants embroiled in patent wars now invest in elaborate hackathons, where rival engineers collaborate on neutral projects, direct descendants of medieval guild festivals that forced competing artisans to jointly construct cathedrals stained glass. The Silicon Valley practice of walking meetings, where adversaries hash out disputes while hiking, mirrors the purposeful pacing of monastery cloisters where abbots mediated feuds. Even the modern office's open floor plan and communal snack areas unconsciously echo the great halls where breaking bread signaled truce. Religious leaders still wield medieval-inspired symbolic gestures with remarkable effect. Pope Francis' 2021 visit to Iraq included him praying in the ruins of Mosul's Al-Nuri Mosque, a deliberate echo of the Cluny Abbey monks who rebuilt rival lords' burnt villages as peace offerings. The interfaith peace football matches organized in divided cities from Belfast to Beirut operate on the same psychological principle as jousting tournaments, letting competition channel aggression into structure rather than chaos. One Bosnian coach described how teenage players who'd been taught to hate each other's ethnic groups began exchanging jerseys after tournaments, just as medieval knights swapped favors. The limitations remain unchanged since the Middle Ages. Festive goodwill rarely outlasts underlying inequities. The 2000s idol TV franchises that brought together Israeli and Palestinian singers, or the joint Israeli-Jordanian solar projects celebrated at desert festivals, haven't resolved geopolitical conflict. Like the fleeting truces of medieval harvest festivals, these modern efforts create breathing space rather than permanent solutions, yet the breathing space matters. When Ukrainian and Russian musicians performed side by side at the 2022 Concert for Peace in Berlin, playing the same folk melodies their ancestors once shared at Kiev's medieval market fairs, they proved that some connections withstand even the ugliest divisions. The most successful modern applications blend old wisdom with new scale. China's Belt and Road Initiative stages cultural festivals along ancient Silk Road routes, consciously reviving the merchant fair model that once connected Constantinople to Xi'an. Germany's post-war Twin Towns program, pairing cities across former battle lines, operates like a continent-wide version of those medieval marriages between rival houses. Even the European Union's Erasmus student exchange echoes the wandering scholar traditions of 12th century peace monasteries. What these strategies share is a rejection of transactional diplomacy in favor of transformational experiences. The recognition that treaties alone can't heal what shared laughter, music, or athletic triumph might. The medieval world understood that peace isn't just the absence of war, but the presence of connections woven through 1,000 small, joyful moments. In an era of digital alienation and polarized politics, that lesson feels more vital than ever. Perhaps the next breakthrough in conflict resolution won't come from a summit room, but from a festival ground where old enemies find themselves once again singing the same song under the same stars. Medieval festivals were never just about feasting and merriment. They were the operating system of an entire diplomatic network, running on the silent code of shared experience. Beneath the surface of those colorful pageants lay a meticulous calculus, every toast measured in political capital, every tournament scoring prestige points instead of blood, every feast seating chart mapping alliances more accurately than any royal ledger. The real magic wasn't in the gilded decorations or the roasted swans, but in the way these gatherings hacked human psychology itself. They created temporary worlds where enemies could rehearse peace until it became habit, where competition was channeled into chess matches instead of cavalry charges, where the simple act of passing a wine cup could rewrite decades of animosity. Fast forward to today, and we're still running variations on that ancient playbook. Think about the way Olympic athletes exchange pins regardless of their nation's tensions, or how international science fairs become neutral ground for rival superpowers. The United Nations cultural exchange programs, those are just medieval pilgrimage routes with PowerPoints. Even corporate team-building retreats, with their forced trust falls and awkward karaoke sessions, unwittingly mimic the Burgundian duke's strategy of bonding through shared discomfort. What's fascinating is how modern neuroscience now confirms what festival planners intuited centuries ago. Synchronized activities, from dancing to singing, release oxytocin and dopamine, chemically reinforcing the very connections those ancient hosts sought to create. Yet something fundamental has shifted. Where medieval festivals derived power from scarcity, those rare moments of respite in brutal lives, our modern world drowns in endless distractions. A 15th century peasant would remember a May Day celebration for months. We scroll past viral videos in seconds. The very abundance of contemporary spectacles has diluted their potency. Imagine if the field of the cloth of gold happened weekly. The guilt would flake, the wonder fade. This is the paradox we face. Never have we had more tools for connection, yet never have they felt so fleeting. The festival's true legacy isn't in their specific rituals, but in their underlying wisdom. That peace isn't just negotiated across tables, but woven through countless small, shared joys. When Ukrainian and Russian musicians performed Schubert together at a Berlin concert hall during the height of tensions, or when Israeli and Palestinian chefs collaborate on cookbooks, they're tapping into that same ancient current. These moments matter not because they solve conflicts outright, but because they preserve lines of connection when all others snap. Like the medieval harvest festivals that kept trade routes open despite noble feuds, they maintain channels for when cooler heads eventually prevail. So next time you find yourself at a wedding where feuding relatives awkwardly share a dance floor, or a neighborhood block party that temporarily smooths over petty grievances, you're witnessing the living echo of those medieval peace festivals. The methods have modernized. No one's exchanging falcons or swearing on garter belts, but the human firmware remains unchanged. We still crave those spaces where strife pauses, where we're reminded that behind every label of enemy or rival breathes someone who, given the right setting, might laugh at the same jokes or marvel at the same fireworks. If this exploration of history's hidden peacekeepers resonated with you, don't just smash that like button, consider it your digital version of tossing a flower garland onto the festival bonfire of shared knowledge. And down in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where do you see modern versions of this festive diplomacy playing out? Music festivals that bridge cultural divides. Esports tournaments connecting geopolitical rivals. The conversation doesn't end here after all. The best festivals were always about keeping the dialogue alive long after the last torch guttered out.